Why the cross? God chose the most shameful death in history. Here's the hidden reason. There's a piece of jewelry around the neck of the person sitting next to you on the subway right now, or hanging from a rear-view mirror, or tattooed on someone's wrist in elegant script. You've probably seen it 100 times today and not thought anything of it. It's a cross. And here's what's strange about that. In the first century, if you had told someone that one day this symbol, this specific instrument of torture and public humiliation, would be turned into gold pendants and wedding decorations, they would have looked at you like you were insane or deeply disturbed. It would be like telling someone today that in 2,000 years, people will be wearing little golden electric chairs around their necks to show how much they loved someone. That's not an exaggeration. That's actually the closest modern equivalent we have to what the cross meant in the Roman world. So the question I want to spend the next 35 minutes with you exploring is not simply why Jesus died. The question is far more specific than that, and far more uncomfortable. Why did God, if we're taking the Christian story seriously for a moment, why did a being of infinite power and infinite creativity choose this? Why the cross? Why the method specifically designed to maximize shame, maximize suffering, and maximize public humiliation? Why not a battlefield death, noble and clean? Why not something private and peaceful? Why not literally any other way? I've heard a lot of answers to this question, and most of them, honestly, feel a little too neat. They feel like they're resolving the tension too quickly. So what I want to do today is sit in that tension a little longer than most people are comfortable with, because I think the answer, the real answer, is hiding inside the discomfort, not on the other side of it. Let's start with what the cross actually was, because I think we've lost the ability to feel its weight, and if we can't feel its weight, we can't understand why it matters. In the Roman Empire, there were multiple ways to execute someone. You could behead them, which was reserved for Roman citizens and was considered dignified. You could drown them, you could burn them, you could throw them to animals in the arena. And then, at the very bottom of the list, the method reserved specifically for the worst criminals, for runaway slaves, for enemies of the state who needed to be made into public examples, there was crucifixion. And crucifixion was designed to be slow. That was the entire point. A quick death was a mercy. Crucifixion was the opposite of mercy. A person crucified could survive for anywhere between a few hours and several days, depending on their physical condition. They would die primarily from asphyxiation, from the inability to keep pushing themselves up on the nails in their feet to breathe. Every breath became a choice: endure the agony of pushing up against the iron spike through your feet, or stop fighting and slowly suffocate. This went on for hours. But here's what the historical accounts emphasize that we often skip over. The physical torture was only one dimension of crucifixion. The Romans were not sadistic without strategy. Crucifixion was a psychological weapon. It was a social weapon. It was designed to strip away every layer of a person's dignity and humanity in public, so that the crowd watching would be reminded of what the empire could do to anyone who stepped out of line. The condemned were stripped completely naked. This is something we sanitize in every painting and every film. Jesus is always depicted with at least a cloth around his waist, but the historical record is clear. Complete nakedness was part of the sentence. It was part of the humiliation. Then the person was hung in the most exposed public place possible, on a roadside, at city entrances, so that maximum numbers of people would pass by and see. And here's a detail that cuts me every time I encounter it. The Romans would sometimes post a sign above the crucified person listing their crime. In Jesus' case, Pontius Pilate had a sign written that said, "The King of the Jews." It was meant as mockery. It was Pilate's way of sneering at both Jesus and at the Jewish people simultaneously. But the sign also meant that everyone who walked by knew exactly who this person was and why they were there. There was nowhere to hide, no privacy in dying, no dignity in the final hours. And then there's a dimension of this that goes beyond the Roman dimension, because for Jesus, being Jewish mattered to what the cross meant. There is a line in the book of Deuteronomy, the ancient Jewish law, that says this: "Anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse." This was not a metaphor. This was legal theological reality for a first-century Jewish person. To be crucified, to be hung on a tree, was not just to be seen as a criminal by Rome. It was to be seen as someone cursed and rejected by God himself. The religious and the political combined in this one form of execution to say, this person has been abandoned by both heaven and earth. Let that land for a moment. The cross was the one death that simultaneously declared, Rome rejects you, your people reject you, and your God has cursed you. Now, Before I go further, I want to name the question that's probably forming in your mind right now, because it's a fair question and I don't want to dodge it. The question is, okay, but couldn't God have found another way? Couldn't the atonement, whatever theological mechanism you believe was at work, couldn't it have happened through some other method? Was the cross really necessary, or was it just one option among many? This is where I think most theological explanations start to feel unsatisfying, because they often answer the question of mechanism, but not the question of meaning. They'll say, the cross was necessary because of God's justice and the demands of the law, and maybe that's true. But it still doesn't answer the deeper question, why this shape? Why this specific combination of physical agony, public shame, social rejection, and divine curse? I want to propose a framework today that I haven't heard articulated quite this way before. I want to suggest that the cross was not just a payment for human sin, though I believe it was that. I want to suggest that the cross was also a complete diagnosis and a complete cure for the deepest wound in human existence. And that wound is not primarily guilt. The wound is abandonment. Think about the experiences that break people most completely. Not just pain. We can endure enormous amounts of pain if we know someone is with us, if we know someone sees us, if we know our suffering has meaning. What breaks people is not pain alone. What breaks people is pain combined with isolation, pain combined with meaninglessness, pain combined with invisibility. The feeling that you are going through the worst thing you have ever experienced and no one, not the people around you, not the universe, not God, is present with you in it. That is the deepest wound in human experience. And I want to call it the architecture of abandonment because abandonment isn't one single thing. It has dimensions, it has layers. It attacks you from multiple directions at once. And unless you have experienced something that reaches every dimension simultaneously, you have not experienced the fullness of what abandonment can do to a human soul. And here's the claim I want to build over the next 20 minutes. The cross was the one place in history where God entered every single dimension of human abandonment at the exact same moment. To show you what I mean, I need to introduce you to 3 people from the Bible who are not the people you're expecting. Not Peter, not Paul, not Mary Magdalene. I want to talk about Job and Elijah and a slave woman named Hagar, because each of these 3 people experienced a different mention of abandonment, and together they map out the full architecture of what Jesus entered on the cross. Let's start with Job. If you know Job's story, you know the basics. He is described at the opening of the book as blameless and upright, a man of great wealth and deep faith, and then in a series of catastrophic events he loses everything. His children die, his property is destroyed, his health collapses. He's covered in painful sores from head to foot, and he ends up sitting on an ash heap, scraping his wounds with a piece of broken pottery, trying to understand what has happened to him. And then his friends arrive, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and later a young man named Elihu, and for 7 days they sit in silence with him. 7 days of silence, which is actually the most theologically profound thing they do in the entire book. Because after the silence ends, they start talking, and everything they say is wrong. They offer him explanations. They tell him that he must have sinned, that God doesn't punish the innocent, that suffering always has a moral cause, that if he would just examine himself honestly and repent of whatever hidden sin he's holding onto, God would restore him. And Job, to his credit, keeps pushing back. He says, I have not sinned in the way you're describing. I know my own heart, and I cannot find God anywhere. I call out to him and there is no answer. I look east, he is not there. I look west, he is not there. I look north and south, silence. The most devastating verse in the book of Job for me is not the one where he loses his children. It's this one in chapter 19. Even my close friends have turned against me, and those I loved have become my enemies. And a few verses later, I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. Do you hear what Job is experiencing? He is suffering. That's one dimension. But simultaneously, he is being given wrong answers by the people who should know better. The people who are supposed to represent wisdom and consolation are making it worse. And God is completely silent. This is what I'm calling the abandonment of explanation. It's the experience of being in profound pain and simultaneously being handed theological justifications for why you deserve it. The experience of crying out to heaven and hearing nothing back. The experience of your intellectual framework for why God is good and why life makes sense completely collapsing under the weight of what you're going through. I want to ask you, have you ever been there? Have you ever been in a season of pain where the explanations people offered you made you feel worse, not better? where every God must be teaching you something through this, or there must be a reason, landed like a stone instead of a comfort. Where you cried out and the silence from heaven felt louder than any voice. Job experienced the abandonment of explanation, and this is the first dimension of abandonment that Jesus entered on the cross. Because look at what happened at Calvary. As Jesus hung there, the religious leaders, the theologians of their day, the people who were supposed to represent God's wisdom, walked by and offered their explanations. He saved others, but he can't save himself. Let God rescue him now if he wants him, for he said, "I am the Son of God." They were saying, in effect, if you were truly righteous, this would not be happening to you. This is the same argument Job's friends made. This is the same abandonment of explanation. Suffering compounded by the cruelty of bad theology delivered by people who are convinced they're right. And then there's the silence of heaven over the cross. For 3 hours, darkness covered the land. No voice from the miraculous rescue, no angelic intervention, just silence. The same silence Job screamed into, the same silence that makes suffering unbearable. Jesus entered the abandonment of explanation completely. Now let's talk about Elijah. And this story I want to tell you carefully, because it is one of the most psychologically honest moments in all of Scripture, and it comes right after the greatest triumph of Elijah's life. Elijah is the prophet who called down fire from heaven on Mount Carmel in a direct contest against 450 prophets of the pagan god Baal. He challenges them, "You call on your God, I'll call on mine, and whichever God answers by fire, that is the real God." The prophets of Baal cry out for hours. Nothing happens. Then Elijah prays one prayer, and fire falls from heaven and consumes not just the sacrifice but the altar stones and the surrounding water. It is the most dramatic, most unambiguous divine miracle in the entire Old Testament. And then, almost immediately, Elijah runs for his life. Queen Jezebel threatens to kill him, and something breaks inside of this man. This person who just called down fire from heaven is now running through the wilderness, terrified of a single woman's threat, and he collapses under a juniper tree, a small desert shrub that offers barely any shade, and he prays the most honest prayer I have ever read. He says, "I have had enough, Lord, take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." This is a suicidal prayer. This is a man at the end of himself. And what makes it so piercing is the context. This doesn't happen after years of failure. This happens after his greatest success. He did everything right. He was faithful. He stood alone against hundreds of false prophets and watched God show up in the most spectacular way possible. And it led here, to a desert bush, to a death wish. And look at what God does in response. Because this is the part of the story that most people summarize too quickly. God doesn't rebuke Elijah. God doesn't lecture him about having more faith. God doesn't even immediately answer the theological question underneath his despair. God sends an angel who touches him and says, "Get up and eat. There's a cake baked on hot coals and a jar of water." That's it. That's the whole divine response. Food and rest. Then again, another touch, another get up and eat, because the journey ahead is too great for you. God's first response to Elijah's burnout and suicidal despair was not a sermon. It was a meal and a nap. Let that breathe for a moment. But what I want you to notice is the specific shape of Elijah's abandonment, because it's different from Job's. Job's crisis was intellectual. The framework of meaning had collapsed. Elijah's crisis was existential. The sense of purpose had collapsed. He had given everything. He had obeyed everything. He had been faithful to his calling. And it had not produced what he thought faithfulness was supposed to produce. The question underneath his despair wasn't, "Why is God doing this to me?" The question was, what was the point of any of this? This is the abandonment of purpose. And it is one of the most common forms of human suffering that we almost never talk about, because it most often strikes people at exactly the wrong moment. Right after they've been faithful, right after they've done everything they thought they were supposed to do, right after they've given their best. And instead of the life they expected, they find themselves sitting under a desert bush, wondering if it was all worth nothing. Have you been there? Have you been faithful to something? A relationship, a calling, a conviction, and watched it fall apart anyway? Have you done everything right and ended up in a place that felt like everything had been for nothing? That the journey of obedience had led not to glory but to a kind of quiet desolation that you couldn't even explain to people, because on paper your life looked fine? Elijah knew this abandonment, and Jesus knew it on the cross. Because think about what the cross represented for the disciples watching. Think about what it represented for anyone who had followed Jesus. 3 years of miracles. 3 years of teaching that was unlike anything anyone had ever heard. 3 years of blind people seeing and dead people walking out of tombs and storms going silent at the sound of a voice. 3 years of what seemed like the beginning of something utterly world-changing. And then this, a borrowed tomb, a shameful execution, the end of the story before it was supposed to end. And what about from Jesus' own perspective? He had healed the sick, and the sick were dying again. He had raised Lazarus, and Lazarus would die again someday. He had taught crowds of thousands, and most of them had drifted away when his teaching became difficult. The religious leaders had not been converted. They had become more determined to destroy him. By the end, his inner circle of 12 had one betraying him for 30 pieces of silver, one denying 3 times that he'd ever known him, and the rest hiding in a locked room. If you had written the story of Jesus' ministry from the outside, without knowing the resurrection, you would have said, this man's purpose was broken. He gave everything, and it produced nothing lasting, nothing sustainable, nothing that would outlast his own death. The cross was the place where divine purpose seemed most completely extinguished. Jesus entered the abandonment of purpose completely. He entered the space where everything you gave yourself to seems to have amounted to nothing, where faithfulness and obedience have led to desolation instead of vindication. And then there is the third person I want you to meet, and this might be the one you're least expecting. Her name is Hagar, and she is a slave woman, not a prophet, not a man of God, not a figure of great religious status. She is owned by Abraham and Sarah, and her story is among the most painful in all of the Old Testament. Abraham and Sarah cannot conceive a child, and Sarah, in a decision that made cultural sense at the time but is heartbreaking to read, gives her slave Hagar to Abraham to sleep with, so that Hagar's child will be considered Sarah's heir. Hagar conceives, and then, predictably, the power dynamic in the household becomes unbearable, and Sarah treats Hagar so harshly that Hagar runs away into the wilderness. She is pregnant, she is alone. She is a slave with no legal standing, no family, no protector, no plan. She is sitting beside a spring of water in the desert. And this is where something extraordinary happens. An angel of the Lord appears to her and speaks with her. And here is the name she gives to God after this encounter: El Roi. It means the God who sees me. And she says something even more remarkable: I have now seen the one who sees me. I want you to stay with that name for a moment, El Roi, the God who sees me. That name comes from somewhere specific. It comes from the experience of being completely unseen by everyone else. Hagar was a slave. She was property. She didn't have a name in most people's accounting. She was part of a household inventory. She was used as a means to an end by the people who were supposed to know God best. And in her running, in her wilderness, in her isolation, she gave God a name that no one else in Scripture gave him, because she experienced something no one else experienced: the specific, violent loneliness of being completely invisible in your suffering. Now fast forward to the second account of Hagar in Genesis 21, because it gets worse before it gets better. By this point, Sarah has conceived miraculously and given birth to Isaac. And now Hagar and her son Ishmael, who is a teenager at this point, are cast out. Abraham gives them bread and a skin of water, and they walk into the wilderness of Beersheba. And the water runs out. And Hagar does something that I find almost impossible to read without my throat tightening. She puts Ishmael, her son, whom she loves, under a bush. She walks away about the distance of a bowshot and sits down and says, I cannot watch the boy die. And she begins to weep. She cannot watch him die. She has been pushed past the point where she can even bear to be present with her own suffering. The abandonment has become so total that she has separated herself from the person she loves most because she cannot endure the witnessing of his death. This is what I'm calling the abandonment of witness. It's not just the experience of suffering. It's the experience of suffering while being completely invisible, unseen, uncounted, unnamed in the world's accounting. It's the suffering of the person who has no status, no voice, no platform to cry from. The person whose pain doesn't register on anyone's radar. The person who is hidden away in a bush in a desert while the rest of the world goes on. And the response, when it comes, is devastating in its tenderness. God opens Hagar's eyes and she sees a well of water. But before that, the text says that God heard the boy crying, not the famous patriarch Abraham, not the chosen family. The slave woman's son weeping in a desert where no one was watching. God heard. God saw El Roi showed up again for the woman who first named him. Now bring this to the cross, because what happened at Calvary was the ultimate abandonment of witness. The Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, the one through whom all things were made, was stripped naked and hung in public. And the crowd didn't see a God. They saw a criminal. They saw a failed Messiah. They saw entertainment. The religious leaders saw a blasphemer getting what he deserved. The Roman soldiers saw another execution. The disciples who were there, just a few women and John, saw a catastrophe they couldn't understand. And in the logic of that moment, from the outside, Jesus was the least important person in Jerusalem. The city was full for Passover. Business was happening. Temple sacrifices were being offered. Pilate was probably already moving on to the next administrative problem. The world was not stopping. The world was not watching in the way that mattered. And here's what pierces me about this. The one who was most unseen, most stripped of visibility, most reduced to a spectacle rather than a person, was the one who sees everything. El Roi, the God who sees. On the cross, he entered the specific abandonment of Hagar. He entered the experience of being looked at by thousands and seen by no one. He entered the invisibility of the person whose suffering doesn't count in the world's accounting. And then comes the moment that I think is the most important moment in the entire gospel. It happens in the early afternoon on a Friday in April, around 3 in the afternoon, 6 hours into the crucifixion. Jesus lifts his voice and says, in Aramaic, in his mother tongue, in the most raw and personal register, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? He is quoting the opening line of Psalm 22. And if you know your Bible, you know that's intentional, is a psalm that begins in absolute desolation and ends in vindication. Most commentators point this out. They say, Jesus was quoting the whole psalm as a prayer. The despair is real, but the ending is implicit. And I believe that's true. But I want to make sure we don't let the theological context dissolve the raw weight of the moment, because Jesus was not reciting a psalm in a calm, composed voice. He was crying out. The Greek word is anaboeison. It means to cry out with a loud voice, to shout with the full force of what remains in you. This is not liturgy. This is a scream. My God, why have you abandoned me? In that sentence, in that single cry, Jesus entered the abandonment of explanation, the abandonment of purpose, and the abandonment of witness all at once. He cried into the same silence Job screamed into. He stood at the place where Elijah collapsed and asked what the point of it all was. He entered the invisibility that Hagar named from a desert bush. And he did all three simultaneously, in one body, in one afternoon, on one piece of wood. This is why the cross had to be the cross. Not just because of ancient prophecy, though the prophecies point to it with remarkable precision. Not just because of legal and theological necessity, though those frameworks matter, but because the cross was the one place in history where God could enter every dimension of human abandonment at the exact same moment. It was the architectural intersection of every kind of aloneness that has ever destroyed a human soul. And I want to show you something about the shape, because I don't think it's an accident that the cross is shaped the way it is. Two beams, one vertical, one horizontal. The vertical beam reaches upward, toward heaven, toward God, toward the divine. The horizontal beam stretches outward, toward humanity, toward community, toward the social world. And at the intersection of those two beams, at the exact crossing point, was where they drove the nails through Jesus' hands and hung his body. Think about what that intersection represents. The vertical dimension of the cross is where the abandonment of heaven happens. This is where the cry of my God, rings out. This is where the silence of God, the same silence Job beat his fists against, descends. The cross is the place where Jesus experienced from the inside what it feels to reach toward God and feel nothing come back. This is the dimension of abandonment that religious people know best and talk about least, because it's terrifying to admit that you have reached for God and felt only silence. But Jesus went there. He went there fully. The horizontal dimension of the cross is where the abandonment of community happens. This is where the stripping naked occurs. This is where the mocking crowd stands. This is where friends have fled and enemies have gathered. This is where social death happens alongside physical death. The person on the cross was not just dying, they were being publicly erased as a human being. Their dignity, their identity, their belonging, all of it was stripped away along the horizontal plane of human relationship. This is the dimension of abandonment that Hagar knew. The invisibility, the reduction to a thing rather than a person, the suffering that no one with power will acknowledge. And the vertical and the horizontal meet at the center, which is where Jesus hangs. His body was literally the intersection of these two abandonment dimensions. He was, in his physical position, stretched between the silence of heaven above and the rejection of humanity around him. His arms forced open, not closed, not defensive, but open and stretched, toward both. I find that detail almost unbearable in its beauty. His arms were stretched open toward a world that was rejecting him, toward a heaven that was silent. He did not die curled inward, protecting himself. He died opened outward, arms extended in both directions, body nailed to the crossing point of every abandonment. And here's the thing about architecture. The purpose of a building is not the building itself. The purpose is what the building makes possible. A hospital building exists so that healing can happen inside it. A school building exists so that learning can happen inside it. The architecture serves the life that takes place within it. The architecture of the cross, the architecture of abandonment, existed to make something possible, to make a kind of meeting possible that could not have happened any other way. Because if Jesus had died quietly, privately, peacefully, his death would have reached the people who suffer quietly, privately, peacefully. If he had died heroically on a battlefield, his death would have resonated with the warrior, the fighter, the person who goes down swinging. But by dying in the way that encompassed every dimension of abandonment simultaneously, his death has the capacity to reach every single person who has ever felt alone in their suffering, regardless of the specific shape of their aloneness. You cannot come to the cross and say, "You don't know what it's like to be in pain and be given wrong answers by people who are supposed to help you." He does. He hung there while the theologians mocked him. You cannot come to the cross and say, "You don't know what it's like to have given everything and feel like it all meant nothing." He does. He had given 3 years of miracles and teaching and love, and died with a small handful of terrified followers. You cannot come to the cross and say, "You don't know what it's like to suffer without anyone really seeing you, to be invisible in your pain." He does. He was stripped, exposed, and reduced to a spectacle by the very world he had made. Every dimension of abandonment he entered it, not from the outside, from the inside, fully human, fully feeling every weight of every silence, every rejection, every extinguished hope. And then, and I need you to stay with me here, because this is the turn that changes everything. Something happened that no architecture of abandonment had ever produced before. The stone rolled away. The resurrection is not a footnote to the cross. The resurrection is the answer to the cross. And the answer is not a theological proposition. The answer is a person walking out of a tomb. The answer is the same voice that cried, my God, why have you abandoned me?" saying 3 days later to a weeping woman in a garden, Mary. Just her name. That's the first word of the resurrected world, her name, the God who sees. Speaking the name of the person who is seen, the abandonment of explanation answered, not with a theological treatise, but with an empty tomb that made everything reorient. The abandonment of purpose answered, not with a new plan from heaven, but with the realization that the apparent failure was the strategy all along. The abandonment of witness answered, not with public vindication in front of Pilate and the Sanhedrin, but in a private garden to a weeping woman, spoken in the most intimate register imaginable. He answers abandonment the same way he answered Elijah's collapse under the juniper tree, not with a lecture, not with a sermon, with presence, with touch, with a name spoken, and this is why the cross had to be the cross. It had to be that shape because the wound it was entering was that large. It had to be that public because the shame it was absorbing was that deep. It had to be that slow because the silence it was filling had lasted that long across human history, all the way back to the first moment a human being sat in pain and felt that the universe had turned its face away. The cross was not God's plan B. It was not a tragedy that God then redeemed after the fact. The cross was the most precise, most complete, most architecturally perfect response to the specific nature of human brokenness that has ever existed or ever could exist. Because the deepest thing that's broken in us is not our moral record, though that matters. The deepest thing that's broken in us is the belief, formed in our suffering, that we are fundamentally alone, that when it gets bad enough, there is no one there, that the silence is the truth about the universe. And God's answer to that belief was not an argument. It was an event. It was the Word becoming flesh, entering the deepest silence and speaking from inside it. There is a moment in Psalm 22, the very psalm Jesus quotes from the cross, where the tone shifts. The psalmist has been crying out in desolation, and then somewhere in the middle of the psalm, something changes. He says, "For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help." The shift happens before the rescue is complete, before the circumstances change. The shift happens in the act of being heard, in the realization that the cry into the silence was not received by silence but by a listener. That is the theology of the cross, lived from the inside. And I want to close with something that I think gets missed in most treatments of this subject. Because we've spent time understanding the cross intellectually, and that's good, that's important. But the cross is not ultimately an idea to be understood. It's an invitation to be accepted. The invitation is not simply, Accept that Jesus died for your sins. The invitation is far more intimate and far more costly than that. The invitation is, bring the specific shape of your abandonment to the specific architecture of this cross, and find that there is a beam that corresponds to your exact dimension of aloneness. If your abandonment is intellectual, if you are the person sitting in suffering while people hand you explanations that make it worse, if you have cried out and heard only silence, there is a cry from Golgotha that matches yours. You are not alone in that silence. Someone entered it before you. Someone entered it all the way to the bottom. If your abandonment is existential, if you are the person who has been faithful and obedient and given everything and arrived at a place that looks like desolation, if you are under your own juniper tree wondering what the point of any of it was, there is a moment on that cross that speaks to yours. The one who gave everything and seemed to have produced nothing, and then became the hinge point of all of human history. Your faithfulness is not invisible. Your desolation is not the end of your story, because it was not the end of his. If your abandonment is relational, if you are the person who has been invisible, whose suffering has not been witnessed by anyone with the power to help, who has been stripped of dignity and reduced to a function or a problem or an inconvenience, there is a cross on a hill outside Jerusalem where the God who sees was made to feel unseen, so that you could know with absolute certainty that your invisibility has been witnessed by the one who counts. This is why the cross. Not just the cross as concept. The cross as the place where the architecture of every abandonment you have ever experienced was entered, inhabited, and then from the inside transformed. The symbol around people's necks today is not a decorative anachronism. It is, for those who understand what it means, the compressed symbol of the most radical claim ever made about the universe, that it is not fundamentally silent, that the silence was entered and broken from the inside, that someone was there in the worst of it, not watching from a safe distance, but nailed into the center of it, arms stretched open toward both heaven and humanity, holding the crossing point between every kind of abandonment that human beings have ever known. And he said, I have had enough. No, that was Elijah. But Jesus entered that space too. No, that was Hagar. But Jesus entered that space too, and he said, I look east and he is not there. I look west and he is not there. No, that was Job. But Jesus entered that space too. And then he said something none of them said. Not, it is over, not, I give up. The Greek word is tetelestai, a word used in commerce to mean paid in full. A word used in victory to mean accomplished completely. The architecture of abandonment was not just entered, it was transformed from the inside. The structure that was meant to be a statement of rejection became the foundation of the most permanent belonging ever offered to a human being, paid in full, accomplished completely. Not one dimension of your aloneness left unaddressed, not one silence left without a voice that spoke from inside at first. That is why the cross, that is why this shape, that is why this specific, brutal, public, theologically cursed, socially humiliating, deliberately slow and exposed death, because nothing less would have been enough to reach every human being who has ever sat in the dark and believed that the universe had turned its face away. The cross says, you were wrong about the silence, and the proof is that someone entered it all the way down and came back.